You have learned that pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Some plants need pollinating agents to transfer the pollen grains. Drag and drop the agents of pollination to the flowers. Let's find out what happens after pollination. In this unit, you are going to learn about fertilization, which occurs after pollination. At the end of this unit, you should be able to answer the In pollination, you observed that the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to the stigma. Have you ever wondered what the role of a pollen grain is? During fertilization, the male gamete in the pollen grain moves towards the female gamete. Where do you think fertilization occurs in a flower? Fertilization occurs when the male gamete fuses with the female gamete in the ovule. Now, let's find out how fertilization occurs. When a flower matures, its stigma becomes sticky. When a pollen grain is transferred onto the stigma, it will germinate in the sugary solution and grow a pollen tube. The pollen tube with the male gamete grows down the style towards the ovule in the ovary. When the pollen tube reaches the ovule, the end of the pollen tube breaks and the male gamete is released into the ovule, which contains the female gamete. The male gamete then fuses with the female gamete to form a zygote. Thus, fertilization is said to have occurred. Let's look at the question again. What is the role of a pollen grain? A pollen grain delivers the male gamete to the ovule in the ovary to fuse with the female gamete during fertilization. Drag and drop the names of the parts into the correct boxes. What happens to a pollen grain when it falls on a Which part of the flower Fertilization takes place in the ovule. When a flower matures, its stigma becomes sticky. The pollen grain that is transferred onto the stigma will germinate in the sugary solution and grow a pollen tube. The pollen tube with the male gamete grows down the style towards the ovule in the ovary. When the pollen tube reaches the ovary, the end of the pollen tube breaks and the male gamete is released into the ovule to fuse with the female gamete. We are lucky to have a wide variety of local fruits like rambutan, guava, durian, and cempedak. The start of a fruit season begins with the trees bearing flowers. Have you ever wondered how flowers from fruit trees change into juicy and fleshy fruits? After a flower has been fertilized, the petals, sepals, stamen, and stigma wither and fall to the ground. The ovary grows rapidly in size and develops into a fruit. At the same time, the fertilized ovules will develop to become seeds. A fruit can be described as being a fertilized and ripened ovary containing seeds. Let's look at the question again. How can flowers from fruit trees change into juicy and fleshy fruits? After fertilization, the ovary and ovules will develop. The ovary will become bigger and bigger through cell division to become the fruit. The fertilized ovules will then become seeds. Key in the numbers 1, 2, and 3 into the boxes to show the correct sequence in the formation of fruit and seed. Click Check Answer to check if you have answered correctly. A fruit is a fertilized and with After fertilization, the petals, sepals, stamens, and stigma will wither and fall off. The ovary grows rapidly to become the fruit, while the fertilized ovules will become seeds. Which of the following parts is correctly read? Which in? What are the in? Are you? Click on one of the questions to see the answer. Where does fertilization take place in a flower? Fertilization takes place in the ovule, which is found inside the ovary. How does fertilization occur in plants? During pollination, pollen grains are transferred onto the sticky stigma. A pollen grain germinates in the sugary solution and grows a pollen tube. The pollen tube, which contains the male gamete, grows down the style towards the ovule. When the pollen tube reaches the ovule, the end of the pollen tube breaks and the male gamete is released into the ovule, which contains the female gamete. Fertilization occurs when the male gamete fuses with the female gamete in the ovule. How are fruits and seeds formed? After a flower has been fertilized, the petals, sepals, stamen, and stigma wither and fall to the ground. The ovary grows bigger and bigger to form a fruit. At the same time, the ovules change into seeds. The thalassia is a water plant. How does fertilization occur in water plants such as thalassia? Find out more about underwater fertilization. Pa Ali planted some seedless guava trees in his orchard. The trees grew and produced sweet, juicy, and seedless guava fruits. 3 years later, he discovered that there were seeds in the guavas. How did it happen? Find out more